Welcome to Eric Hörst's Training for Climbing podcast. Training for Climbing podcast. Training for climbing. Training for climbing. Training for climbing.
Hello everybody, I'm Eric Hörst from trainingforclimbing.com, and I'm back with another Training for Climbing podcast. This is going to be an Ask Coach Hörst episode where I answer a number of listener questions submitted by way of my Twitter feed, which is @trainforclimbing. And so I invite you to submit a question. If you have a very specific, dire question you need to ask Coach Hörst, you can submit it on my Twitter feed as well. And I'll be doing one of these about every month or so. And so I'll put your question into the queue and hopefully you'll make it into a future podcast. Upcoming in August, the next Training for Climbing podcast will be kind of a wrap-up of this series on energy system training. We started with this back, I guess it was maybe in April or maybe even March, where I had the first of the 4 episodes on energy system training. And those are cutting-edge, content-rich podcasts, which I believe you could listen to over and over again and hopefully come to understand the material a little better with each listen and get a sense of how it relates to you and where you're at in your climbing and how you can train more effectively using energy system training as a conceptual model. And this is a way to take your training to the next level. A lot of climbers are still training the way climbers trained 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And now is the time that the science of climbing is catching up and we're able to push things forward. And I think training for climbing is really going to progress and become advanced in the coming years as we ramp up for the Olympics and push beyond that. And so this podcast is one of the ways you'll get exposed to this new material that's coming online that's being developed by coaches and researchers like myself. In fact, I just returned from Europe where I attended the 4th Congress of the International Rock Climbing Researchers Association. This is an international group of researchers, doctors, and coaches that come together every couple of years and share what they're working on, share their research. I gave a keynote presentation on the training day, the last day of the 1-week Congress, and it was just an incredible time, which I'll tell you about in the next podcast. I don't want to dig into that now, but there was a lot of great speakers and coaches and exchange of ideas that I think I can spend a little more time perhaps in the next podcast getting into. And so I spent about a week in Chamonix. I was there with my family, but I was in the conference. They were out being tourists and also being climbers. And, then we spent the rest of the month as a family. We climbed in the Frankenjura in Germany, and we climbed at Seus in the south of France for a few days, and we climbed in northern Italy just a bit. And, so we traveled around quite a bit. It's always kind of funny how, American climbers, we tend to drive a lot. I know I do. Just going to the New River Gorge is 6 hours. Going to the Red River Gorge is 9 hours from where I live. And every summer we travel out west for a month or two and drive, 8 or 10,000 miles in the process. And so Europe looks pretty small to my eyes, and traveling one country to another, not a big deal. It's like traveling one state to another, at least from the paradigm of an American climber. But my European climbing friends think I'm a little crazy, or think we're a little crazy, as much driving as we do. Driving 10 hours from Seus to the Frankenjura, a marathon drive to the Europeans, and to me that's like a weekend at the Red. So in any case, enough on that. Let's move on to answering some of these reader questions. And some of these I'll just read you straight up what they sent to me if they're short and to the point. A couple of the questions are really long and detailed, so I'll try to paraphrase. And I think you're going to find we cover a lot of territory here with this series of half dozen questions, and some of it may connect and be relevant to you, and you can hopefully learn something and benefit from listening in to this question and answer session. So first up, I have a question from David in Atlanta, Georgia. And he writes, "Dear Coach Hörst, I love your podcasts, and I would love to take a shot at having one of my questions featured." He sent me 2 questions, and here's the one that I decided to focus on here and answer in this podcast. He writes, "I am a pilot, and so I'm on the road for 8 days at a time, in and out of hotels every single day. And then I'm home in Atlanta for 6 days before the cycle repeats. So when I'm on the road, I have access to hotel gyms, and every once in a while, I can find a climbing gym, but my schedule's erratic, the destinations are never the same, and so many towns don't have a gym nearby. When I'm at home, I do get to the gym usually once or twice a week and climb outdoors once or twice during my 6 days off. So what I'm asking you is, what suggestions do you have to kind of solidify my training program? Is there a way to do a periodized training program given this erratic schedule? And I'm just wondering what advice you have, Eric, for someone with such a challenging and tricky schedule and a relative lack of training resources when I'm on the road. Okay, David, well, that is certainly a tough schedule to deal with, and it's hard to build a consistent, high-quality training program around such a chaotic schedule with lack of access to a climbing gym or a wide range of training tools. But that said, when there's a will, there's a way. And so with a little planning, I think we could piece together a decent training program. I think you can engage in a decent training program even given 8 days on the road or in the air. And so I guess for those 8-day trips where you're out flying city to city and staying in a hotel for a week straight, if you can find a climbing gym in one of those cities near the airport where it's feasible to get in for a 2 or 3 hour climbing session, I think that's the number one goal for your travel spells. And so when you get to the gym, you need to kind of try to pack in as much climbing and training as you can, given that hopefully one visit during your travel week. So beginning with a 30-minute warm-up, I would progress then into an hour of hard bouldering, really concentrating on doing hard moves and working strength and power on a bouldering wall. And then take maybe a 30-minute rest, do some stretching. If you have most of the day off and you don't have to rush back to the airport, well then relax and hopefully enjoy the experience of being in a climbing gym and not in the cockpit of a plane. And then after a break, commence with an hour of roped climbing. If you can get a belay or if there's auto belays available, getting on a rope and training longer routes where you're climbing for 2, 3, 4 minutes straight will work more that aerobic energy system and anaerobic lactic energy system. And so while it's not an ideal situation to train all 3 energy systems in one workout, I think this is a case where you can justify it, given your limited access to a climbing gym. And so if you have a 2 or 3 hour visit to a climbing gym, try to pack in a lot of climbing, work through kind of all of your energy systems, and hopefully walk out with a good workout under your belt. And then perhaps the next day you can just take a day off from training and not feel so bad sitting in the cockpit perhaps for an 8-hour flight across the country or whatever it may be. Now, of course, many days this won't be an option. You'll be in a city where there is no climbing gym near the hotel or near the airport. And so that hotel gym is your best bet. Get in there. I guess I would begin with an aerobic session, maybe 2 days a week if you can get in on a treadmill or a Stairmaster or a rowing machine or whatever they have, or even go out for a run if the weather is decent. A couple of good aerobic sessions to burn calories, get your metabolism up, since I trust that your flying days you're sitting most of the time. It's good to kind of elevate your metabolism, and just cardiovascular workouts are good, especially for an aging athlete. I think it's a a fairly important part of the program, a couple days a week, to do some type of generalized aerobic activity. Now, in that hotel gym, there's usually some type of fitness equipment in terms of strength training, maybe perhaps dumbbells or some type of universal or Cybex machine that you can work some pushing and pulling muscles, and that would be certainly something useful to do a couple of days a week. But more specific training, climbing specific training, is what I would hope you could do 2 days a week in that hotel gym. And here's how you can do that. Purchase a portable sling trainer and a portable hangboard. Both are small and light and would fit into carry-on baggage. For instance, like a TRX sling trainer and the Flash portable hangboard by Tension Climbing are nice tools that you can take on the road with you, and all you need is really a pull-up bar or some machine that has a crossbar that you can hang these from. And in the hotel, you could do a fingerboard workout. You could do some sling trainer exercises for your rotator cuff and your scapular stabilizers, and doing some pull-ups, some fingertip pull-ups. Being creative. Obviously, you're limited. You're not going to be able to do campus training, or probably not even able to do any weighted hangs. But at least being engaged in some climbing-specific training a couple days a week in that hotel gym via these portable exercise tools, I think is a good way to go about doing it. And again, make that one day in a climbing gym your ultimate goal during your travel week. So out of a 7 or 8 day spell on the road, hopefully you can get 3 days of climbing specific exercise, 1 day in a climbing gym, and then 2 days in a hotel gym using these portable training tools, the sling trainer and the Flash portable fingerboard by Tension Climbing. So there you go. I hope that helps you out. Of course, when you're home, enjoy your time with your family. Get out to the climbing gym, or better yet, get outside climbing a couple of days if the weather cooperates, because that is ultimately what it's all about, is that time spent on the rock. And so hopefully I've given you some useful tips here that you can apply and that you'll find beneficial. Okay, on to question 2. It's from Mark, and he writes, "Hi, Eric. My girlfriend and I enjoy your podcasts. However, much of what you talk about seems to relate more to elite climbers, and we are 5'10" sport climbers that hope to solidify our abilities and move on towards 5'11s and 5'12s. I'm wondering what suggestions you have for us to improve." Well, Mark, you're right. Certainly my recent podcasts on energy system training have involved some pretty advanced material that is more relevant to advanced and elite level climbers. If you go back, though, through the catalog of the podcasts I've done the last 2 years, I think you'll find that about half of them also give a lot of useful information for climbers that are more in that beginner to intermediate range of ability. And so dig back through those old podcasts, and I hope you're going to find some gold you can mine there. And in terms of the more advanced podcasts, well, maybe there's nothing so much that you can apply now, but you're going to be improving in the months and years to come, and hopefully that material will become more relevant and meaningful to you in the future. So what can you do to improve? Well, the common advice for a more beginner intermediate climber is to just climb more. And that's true to a point. You don't want to be climbing 7 days a week, because climbing is hard on the body. It's especially hard on the tendons. And for new enthusiastic climbers who climb too much, often become injured. And so I do recommend 4 days per week of climbing, but certainly not 6 or 7 days per week of climbing. Climbing is a skill sport. There's physical skills, tactical and mental skills, and those are areas that you can improve on for years, really decades. And so, yes, a good training program has to include some climbing, but also an intermediate climber like you and your girlfriend who are climbing solidly on 5'10s and aspire to advance as soon as possible to 5.11s and 5.12s. That's kind of where some physical training does come in handy. As routes get steeper, there are strength and power requirements and endurance requirements that need to be developed. And so I do think that a couple of days per week, you should be finishing up your climbing sessions with some climbing-specific strength training. And so assuming you're getting 3 or 4 days in at the climbing gym or a combination of in and outdoor climbing, what I would say is take 2 of those indoor sessions per week and finish them up with 30 minutes of dedicated climbing-specific training. What I'm talking about is some fingerboard training, some weighted pull-ups, a variety of core exercises, and really for each of those 3 class of exercises, I'd recommend doing 3 to 5 sets. That's enough. You don't need to do an exhaustive workout, hours and hours and dozens of sets. You might see some elite climbers doing that or some misguided intermediate climbers doing that. But that kind of volume is not necessary at your stage of the game. 3 to 5 sets on the fingerboard, 3 to 5 sets of pull-ups or weighted pull-ups, and 3 to 5 sets of core exercises. That's a pretty decent climbing-specific workout tagged on to the end of your indoor climbing session. In terms of nitty-gritty details, I can't really get into that now. And, the best thing to do is to pick up a copy of my book, Training for Climbing. The 3rd edition, which just came out a couple years ago, is very up-to-date. It will describe each exercise, what is appropriate for a climber of your ability, and there's even some training program guidelines in the book, and there's also a link to download a spreadsheet off my website, trainingforclimbing.com, where the spreadsheet lists all the exercises and then kind of serves as a menu, I guess you would say, that you can pick and choose from to variety of exercises to change things up from time to time and hopefully get you the right volume and intensity of exercises for where you're at, and then help you progress your program as you improve. So there you have it. I think that is some good advice for you in terms of what you can do right now to take your climbing to the next level. Now, as you start bumping up towards that 512 grade, you're going to need to modify things further, and perhaps you want to drop me another email then, or again, Training for Climbing will give you some really solid guidance on what to do as you progress from being an intermediate climber to more of an advanced climber, which in my mind begins right around that 512 level. So on we go to the 3rd question. This comes from Nacho. He's 30 years old and lives in California. He writes, I have been climbing 6 years and training for climbing the last 2 years. Unfortunately, my climbing season consists of 2 weeks in the summer and 2 weeks in the winter, and I spend pretty much the rest of the year training for climbing indoors. And so my question is, how often should I train the anaerobic lactic energy system? Should I do this as part of a mesocycle or a periodized training program to vary the stimulus, or should I focus more on the aerobic energy system or developing maximum strength and power? So, Nacho, the last 4 podcasts really covered all of this territory, though I understand it's tough. I think there must be 5 or 6 hours of content in those 4 podcasts, and it's a lot to kind of wade through and perhaps draw out a specific answer. So let me try to do that for you here. First of all, that lactic energy system, that is what powers sustained high power output climbing. From 15 seconds up to a minute or two, like on a long boulder problem or a sustained sport climb where you have to climb really hard sequences that last a minute or two between rest positions. And it's those situations where you tend to get really pumped and oftentimes perhaps fail with pumped forearms, where your veins are ballooning out and your grip has failed you or cramped up. That is a sign of that anaerobic lactic energy system running aground. Now, in the previous podcasts, I talked about how that energy system It is very important for climbing, but it's also the least trainable of the three energy systems. And many climbers I've found make the mistake of really spending most of their time training that energy system, always going to the gym with the goal of getting pumped because they think that's the answer. But really, it's the least trainable energy system, and it's the energy system which actually, when you work it too much, leads to overtraining, and in extreme situations, even negative results. And so the best approach is to have some type of a periodized training program where you have blocks that focus on the individual energy systems. And the best time to train that anaerobic lactic system is right before your period of performance climbing. So if you have one of those 2-week climbing trips outdoors in the summer or winter, you know when that is coming up, you would want to spend about the month before that trip where you would be doing more workouts that target that anaerobic lactic energy system. So they would be very fatiguing, pumpy, power endurance sessions. But then, of course, you would want to taper those sessions, reduce the volume the final week leading into your trip so that you're fully recovered. You always want to have kind of a deload period before you commence with that performance climbing outside. So what about the rest of the multiple months between your outdoor climbing trips? Well, you do want to build out your maximum strength and power and your aerobic energy system, because those are very trainable attributes that you can elevate month over month and year over year to a higher and higher level. And by elevating those two energy systems, you immediately open the door to more anaerobic lactic capacity. And so you're indirectly improving your lactic system by training up your maximum strength and power, and also your ability to create ATP via the aerobic energy pathway. So it's not wasted time. It's very valuable training time to focus on those other two energy systems. That being said, I'm kind of evolving my thinking here that even when you're doing a targeted block of, let's say, maximum strength and power training, that's the alactic energy system. Let's say you're targeting that for a month or two, or let's say you're training more the aerobic energy system with a lot of submaximal climbing for a month or two. I still think there's benefit to doing one pumpy anaerobic lactic workout per week. It won't elevate that energy system. It won't bring about major adaptations, the buffering and the anaerobic enzymes from a single session. But there's some research beginning to indicate that exposing your muscles to a high lactate content provides a beneficial signaling for certain adaptations, capillary density, lactate transporters, things that come into play to some degree during your aerobic and your maximum strength training. And so even during a strength block or an aerobic endurance block, I do believe climbers should probably put in one session per week of really pumpy anaerobic lactic training. So my advice for you is that between those trips, the bulk of your workouts should be focusing on elevating strength and power and your aerobic power. But one session per week, go to the gym and just enjoy getting pumped, i.e. train that power endurance, that anaerobic lactic energy system, one session per week. And then, of course, a month before your outdoor performance climbing, you want to do multiple sessions per week that target that anaerobic lactic system. So I hope this makes sense. I think it's a good program for you given your situation, and I wish you good luck with it. Okay, so on to the next question. It comes from Maxwell, and he writes, "Hi, Eric. I have recently plateaued at around the bouldering level of V8 and the sport climbing level of 512D, and so I want to start a more dedicated training program, and I'm wondering which of your books would be the best to guide me in developing a climbing-specific program, Training for Climbing or your new Rock Climbers Exercise Guide? What do you recommend? Well, Maxwell, they are very similar books in that they contain a lot of the same exercises, but they are quite different in the content. The Rock Climbers Exercise Guide is literally a book of exercises, kind of an A to Z of exercises for climbers. If you're someone that doesn't really like delving into the science and the reasons why you want to train a certain way, and you're not so much interested in mental training and technique training and nutrition and recovery, you just want to know the exercises, well then, the Rock Climbers Exercise Guide is the book for you. On the other hand, Training for Climbing is, some people call it the Bible of rock climbing performance, in that it covers everything with a lot of scientific detail, tapping into a fair amount of research, and it is super comprehensive in that it does address all facets, all things that influence climbing performance, right down to even addressing climbing injuries. It has a very detailed index in the back of the book, so you can look up a very specific item or topic, muscle or exercise in the index, and it will refer you to a specific page where you'll find the answers you're looking for or the exercises you're looking for. And so given that you're bouldering V8 and sport climbing 512D, that puts you in the advanced category and hopefully on your way to becoming an elite climber if you have the time and desire to really train hard and be disciplined with your climbing and training. And so Training for Climbing is certainly the book for you. It will help guide you into how you can not only get stronger and more powerful and, of course, train all of those three energy systems to the next level, but taking your game into the 513 or eventually 514 realm is about nuance. I use that word a lot because little things make big differences when you're pushing up into those higher grades. It's about how you can be 1% more efficient with your climbing technique and how you can think and strategize to improve your efficiency on a climb, or just your behavior throughout the day, your nutrition, your sleep habits, just training as smart as you can, not necessarily harder, but training smarter. That's what the book Training for Climbing will help you put together, is the most effective training program for you at this time. And as I mentioned earlier, there's even spreadsheets with a menu of exercises that you can pick and choose from that you can download from my website that supplement and complement the content of Training for Climbing. So pick up a copy of that book, read it cover to cover, and then refer back to it frequently as a reference as you develop your training program. And I think it will help you become a very effective self-coach. And if you still feel kind of lost or not dialed in precisely, well then the next best thing is absolutely working with an experienced climbing coach. And hopefully there would be one nearby at a climbing gym or at a town nearby. If you want to go that path, I certainly am an advocate of seeking out and utilizing the expertise of a climbing coach, because nothing beats that one-on-one instruction that you can get from a veteran climbing coach. So good luck, Maxwell, and enjoy the book. Okay, question number 5 comes from Hugo, who resides in Barcelona, Spain. He writes, "Hi Eric, I'm quite bad with underclings and side pulls on steep terrain. I try to use a lot of them when I do circuits, but I'd like to know what specific training exercises I can do to improve in doing these moves on hard sport climbs." Okay, Hugo, well, the first and obvious thing that you've mentioned is to seek out boulder problems in the gym that incorporate powerful undercling and side pull movements so that you can train in a very climbing specific way. That's certainly the first step in the process. Going a bit further, rather than just being stuck with what you can find in the gym, if you have access to a climbing wall of your own, or if the gym will allow you set some very specific routes that are more than just one or two undercling or side pull moves, but have a series of underclings and side pulls in a row where you have to move from one into another, where you might have to wind up and twist one way off of one undercling or side pull, and then as you engage the next side pull or undercling, you have to unwind and twist the other way. And that brings in your core muscles, and it also forces you to really work your body positions. A lot of problems that people have with underclingy or side pulley kind of moves aren't necessarily strength issues, but body position issues. And so more time spent doing those moves and working through sequences that force you to twist one way and then another, finding, again, that nuance, that body position where you have less weight on your hands and more weight on your feet. Suddenly you will feel stronger on those undercling and side pull moves. So it's not just about getting stronger, it's also about becoming more efficient in doing those moves. Now, that being said, one training strategy you could utilize if you have a few of these undercling routes at your gym, or if you set a few of the routes, would be once you get kind of the boulder problem wired, where you can move through it very efficiently with the optimal body position to make each undercling and side pull work just right for you, then escalate things by putting on a 5-kilogram weight belt. And that will make the route certainly harder. You'll still have to find that body position that makes each move work optimally for you, but because you have 5 kilograms around your waist, the climbing specific muscles used in those moves will have to work harder. And so there you will be able to train your strength and your power in that very specific undercling or side pull movement. First learn the move at body weight, then add some weight and repeat the move or the sequence or the problem a couple more times. Do that a couple of days per week, and I think in a month or so, you'll find that you're feeling stronger and actually feeling more confident when you hit those types of moves on routes. Now, a final thing I want to add is that when you're on steep terrain, and especially when you're twisting your body and doing these kind of side pulley or undercling moves, it's very, very core intensive. So core strength is the real wild card. And so committing to doing 2 or 3 rigorous core training sessions per week, I think is also an important part of the recipe to improving. And so investing, say, 20 minutes at the end of a couple of your sessions each week, work through a series of core exercises. You can't just do some crunches and say that's enough. That's maybe one piece of the puzzle, but there's a lot more to developing a strong core. There is the whole posterior chain that needs worked, and there's all the muscles of the upper torso around the shoulders that need to get strong. And so you need to do a variety of exercises like windshield wipers and planking and some front levers. And yes, you can do some crunches as well, but there's a lot more to core training than just doing exercises that target the abdominal muscles. Again, my book, Training for Climbing, has a whole chapter on this topic and delivers 10 or 15 different exercises that you can use to target and create more of a comprehensive core muscle exercise. And that's the type of core training that will really pay off on those steep, powerful routes, especially those where you're twisting and turning off of underclings and side pulls. So there you have it. There's a 2-step process that I think will have you climbing stronger on those steep routes in just a couple of months. Okay, so on we go to the last question of this episode of Ask Coach Hörst, and it's from Clayton, and it's a really long question, and I appreciate what he's getting into. It's a topic involving diet and nutrition and the pros and cons of vegan or vegetarian diet, and this is a complex topic. It's got some ethical and emotional issues, certainly for some people. And there's no simple answer when you delve into this topic. And so I want to tread carefully, but also try to give some valuable feedback and hopefully answer some of your questions here, Clayton. So this is the start of his question. He writes, Eric, I'm a huge fan of yours since I've started climbing, and I'm a person passionate about science, so I've always been excited about the level of rigor and no-nonsense thinking that you bring to the world of climbing knowledge. Eric, keep up the amazing work. And so my reply to you, Clayton, is thank you very much for those kind words. I do try to be scientific and I do try to keep things real, but there's some areas where there aren't very easy answers or there's not a simple right or wrong answer. And this topic that you're asking me about here is one of those areas. Clayton adds here that kind of has a larger physique. He's 6'2", weighs 180 pounds. He's 27 years old. He does mostly bouldering and sport climbing, and his maximum grade is around V10 and 513 plus. So he's pretty much an elite climber in my book. Those are some hard grades. And so specifically, Clayton has 3 questions. The first question is about the pros and cons of consuming a calorie surplus and how that might help or hinder training for climbing. So let's attack that first, and then we'll move on to the second and third questions. With regard to the calorie surplus, he asks, is there a biological or physiological advantage to be gained from consuming a calorie surplus, or is there too much of a negative side in terms of weight gain that might be incurred? And so, that's a really good question. If you talked to a bodybuilder or perhaps a football player or someone in a strength power sport, consuming a calorie surplus is a big part of what they do because they're always seeking to gain muscle mass. They're after hypertrophy. And so putting on weight is often a good thing, especially in a sport like football where, force equals mass times acceleration. So if you can get stronger and faster, that's the acceleration. And if you can put on mass, you have more force to impart on the opponent. Well, of course, climbing, our opponent, if you will, is gravity. And so mass is oftentimes a hindrance, especially on steeper routes, overhanging routes, where you're hanging more on your arms and standing less on your feet, and also on roped routes, longer routes. Mass becomes a real issue when endurance or strength endurance or power endurance is at play. It's a little less of a factor in bouldering. In pure strength power activities, like doing a very short boulder problem, or even speed climbing, as in the competitions where it's a 6 or 7 second sprint up the speed climbing wall, weight is a little less of a factor, and muscle mass is arguably a helpful thing. That fast twitch fiber in the legs for speed climbing and in the upper body for high-end bouldering is not necessarily a bad thing. So for someone with a larger physique, kind of genetically blessed with a bigger build and more fast twitch muscle fiber, the bouldering is perhaps a better fit than elite sport climbing. And so I don't know many 514 climbers that weigh 180 pounds or that weigh 85 or 90 kilograms. But I do know some people that boulder V10 or V12 or V14 that have that larger frame and that larger build. And if you look at a few of the top speed climbers on the World Cup circuit, they're pretty meaty guys. They have a larger build than the top sport climbers do. And so kind of the bottom line is, first of all, we're all dealt kind of a unique hand. Our genetics will somewhat dictate the physique we have. Of course, training and nutrition, we can remodel our physique and our build. I've talked about that in previous podcasts. And it's certainly possible that you could, through nutrition and training, perhaps drop from 180 to 175 or 170 pounds, though taking that to an extreme often has consequences in terms of loss of energy, and you can't starve yourself into becoming a better climber, that's for sure. Kind of a final comment on this whole caloric surplus topic. What I think is a good approach, and kind of what I incorporate to some degree, is that during my winter training block, where I'm totally just training to build strength and power and endurance in anticipation of the next climbing season, I tend to eat a little more. I don't get overly concerned with putting on a few pounds during that winter training season. I kind of think of it as training weight, kind of like hangboard training with extra weight, except it's maybe a few extra pounds on my body. That's part of the process. And I have a higher energy level for long days or hard days of training because I'm not shortchanging myself, and my body can recover more quickly because I'm consuming enough protein and carbohydrate. I'm not cutting corners or being too stingy with my nutrients. And so that's kind of my winter training mode, and you might think of it as having a mild calorie surplus. Certainly I wouldn't want to put on more than 5 pounds during my winter training season. And then, of course, when I segue into my outdoor climbing season, which is my performance climbing season, I dial in my diet, which involves reducing my caloric consumption by a couple hundred calories a day. And over the course of about a month or so, as I'm kind of segueing into my outdoor climbing season, I will lose 3 or 4 or 5 pounds. Some of it may be muscle mass that's not in climbing specific places. Some of it is probably a bit of body fat. My percent body fat off season might be 8 or 10%, and in season might be 4 or 5%. I tend to run pretty lean. That's how I like to perform. And I do find, as primarily a rope climber, every pound makes a difference. If you're on overhanging routes, roped climbing, a few pounds does make a big difference at the higher levels. And that's what you're talking about. If you're climbing 13 plus and trying to get to 14A, well then a few pounds is a big difference. Okay, on to Clayton's second question, and that relates to the ethics and viability of different diet types, vegetarian, vegan, versus an eat everything approach. And he adds that he's increasingly pulled by his ethics, both humanitarian and environmental, to avoid meat. And so he's currently resolved to be an octo-lacto vegetarian. And he adds here that he does consume a lot of eggs and yogurt in the goal of getting enough protein without a wild number of calories. And so my first thought is that sounds like a pretty reasonable diet and a pretty good resolution from your point of view. Eggs and yogurt are excellent protein sources and really good vitamin sources as well. And so I don't think you're in a bad place with what you're talking about. That being said, strength power athletes, the vast majority of them are meat eaters. And although I know the research can be interpreted in different ways, and there's a lot of subjectivity and emotion involved in interpreting the research, and I really do believe that, for instance, a piece of salmon or a lean chicken breast or a very lean piece of red meat is a pretty good thing, a good source of protein for a strength power athlete. Furthermore, there is some new emerging research that is compelling that consuming animal products like bone broth and gelatin and meats, the collagen contained in these products is very high in 2 important amino acids, proline and glycine, which contribute significantly to the collagen synthesis in tendons and ligaments and bones and the extracellular matrix that forms kind of the scaffolding within our muscles that surround the cells and help transport force to the tendons and bones. And so I'm suspicious that a lot of climbers, or at least there's perhaps a correlation between climbers who have recurrent tendon injuries and the lack or complete absence of meat in their diet. climbers, we're hard on our tendons, our fingers, our elbows, our shoulders, and they are being stressed, and they are being on a microscopic level damaged. Crosslinks are being broken when you climb, when you hangboard train, when you campus train. And so you need the building blocks for your tendons to recover, just like your muscles need the building blocks to recover from a workout. And whereas the eggs and yogurt, or even sources of protein from vegetables, from beans and nuts, really do contribute well to the recovery of muscles, those amino acids specific to tendon recovery and collagen synthesis are harder to come by on a vegetarian diet. So I think that's something you have to put, in, kind of part of the calculus when you decide what you're going to consume. And if you have any history of tendon problems, then perhaps a diet void of meats and collagen-type products like bone broth and gelatin is a bad thing. If you don't have any recurrent tendon problems, if you've never had a hint of a tendon injury, then perhaps it's a moot point for you. I should also add, as kind of a final comment here, genetics, we're finding, play a significant role in your predisposition to tendon injuries. And there's, I believe, now 5 genes that have been identified that correlate to an increased risk of ankle sprains and Achilles tendon injuries, and I believe probably even climbers that have frequent tendon problems. Some of it is environmental, the things they do, the improper training or the lack of recovery, but some of it may also be genetic. And that's something I'm going to delve more into on down the road. It's something I am reading and studying extensively on, is the role that genetics play in training adaptations, and I'm just going to leave it there. Third question from Clayton, and we'll wrap up the podcast with this, is how much of a difference does a few pounds make? And I guess I alluded to this earlier, but a few pounds, probably not the biggest deal in the world if you're just into hard bouldering, doing 5-move, 10-second long boulder problems where strength and power rule and endurance is not a factor. Then whether you weigh 175 or 180 may not be that big of a deal. However, long, steep, overhanging sport climbs, 5 pounds is a huge factor when you have to hang on for a long time moving up a steep wall. Finger force to mass ratio and power to mass ratio is a huge factor. And the top sport climbers, name a top sport climber, have very high finger force to mass ratios. And of course, that ratio comes about by having strong fingers and having a relatively low mass. Again, I don't advocate climbers starving themselves, because eventually you will end up weak and miserable and sick, and you can't climb hard in that state. And also, it's not fun. Life needs to be lived and enjoyed, and foods are part of that. And so, again, my personal practice, what I kind of recommend to someone like yourself is, during the off season, open up your diet a little more and enjoy maybe some of those pleasure foods at times. Try to eat as healthfully as you can so that you recover quickly and that you don't put on a lot of body fat during the off season. But then taper things back, withdraw some of those pleasure foods, cut back on things like sugar and alcohol, dessert foods and fried foods. Those are bad things for an elite athlete. And so as you segue into your climbing season, or if you have a trip, a few weeks or a month that you want to be climbing your best, well, then you probably do want to really slim things down in terms of calories and try to hit your diet spot on. And perhaps you might even be on the verge of becoming a little weak and tired. And that's kind of a fence you have to straddle. And I think pro climbers do straddle that, watch their diet closely and train and climb extensively, is kind of just developing that intuitive feel on what they need on a daily basis to stay light, but also not have their energy level drop off. And we're all a little different on that front. And it's something that I think with years of experience, you will gradually be able to hone in on what the best approach for you is. So again, Clayton, there are no easy answers, but hopefully I gave you some usable information there that is based both on some sound science and also on my 40 years plus experience as a climber and 30 years as a coach. Okay, so in wrapping up this podcast, I just want to ask you to please write an iTunes review if you haven't done so already. Please go into iTunes, and if you enjoy these podcasts, please give me a 5-star review and share with the world your thoughts on the Training for Climbing podcast. And also share the link to the podcast. If you go to my website, trainingforclimbing.com, each podcast is on that website. If you can share the link to this podcast or a previous podcast that you really enjoyed, if you can share that on your Twitter feed, on your Facebook page, I would be really grateful, because that is the way we grow a bigger audience. This is free information. I put a lot of effort into this, and so I'd like to have it shared with the widest audience possible. Well, that does it for this episode of the Training for Climbing podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, be safe, be strong, and train on.